The sea is calm tonight, the tide is full. The moon lies fair upon the strait.
Now it is time to take longer strides. Time for a great new American enterprise. Time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth.
The commitment came from John F. Kennedy in May of 1961, a pledge that American astronauts would set foot on the moon by 1970. But it's only part of the story, part of the sound. The superstition, the romance, and above all, the curiosity of man and the moon. Most scientists believe that man has lived on Earth for about 1 million years. He has spent most of that time in awe of the moon. For pre-Neanderthal man, it was his only source of light during the long night, but also something to be regarded with superstition and fear. As the history of man unfolds, the moon becomes the lair of evil and then of deities. The Egyptian god Thoth, it is written, won part of the moon's light and with it created 5 extra days. The Greek goddess Diana lived on the moon, as did the Babylonian god Sin, who flew through the night foiling evildoers with his light. Since the dawn of recorded history, the moon has been of singular influence to man's civilization and culture. The lunar light has cured warts, turned men into werewolves, determined the proper time to plant, harvest, fish, fight battles, court a girl, marry, and so forth. The moon has also been a proper subject for the young'uns. Nobody knows when the children first recited those nursery rhymes or sang the first songs, "Hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle," or hand in hand on the edge of the sand they danced by the light of the moon. And there still exists those curiously American old wives' tales. A maiden who drinks white wine and rosewater and looks through a silk scarf at the moon will see her husband-to-be. Or, if a husband leaves his wife while the moon is waning, he will not be seen by her again. But somewhere beyond superstition, and short of curiosity, was the moon's inspiration for poets.
Swear not by the moon, the inconstant moon that monthly changes in her circled orb, lest that thy love prove likewise variable.
Whenever the moon and stars are set, whenever the wind is high, all night long in the dark and wet, a man goes riding by.
It is the very error of the moon. She comes more near the earth than she was wont, and makes men mad. That orbed maiden with white fire laden, whom mortals call the moon.
By the 17th century, man has the imagination but not the wherewithal to get to the moon, and so he writes. Cyrano de Bergerac takes a lunar trip aboard a chariot powered by firecrackers. Years later, as the hero of Rostand's play, Cyrano contrives 6 ways to get there. For example, sit on an iron plate, hurl a magnet into the air, the iron follows, catch the magnet, throw again, and so proceed indefinitely. In 1638, the hero of Godwin's Man in the Moon is towed there by 25 swans. In 1835, the celebrated Moon story describes the forest and the mountains, the tailless beavers, and human-like lunar quadrupeds as seen in the moon with a powerful telescope. It's all published as a series by the New York Sun as exclusive scientific information, but is in reality a hoax. Then in 1865, Jules Verne writes From the Earth to the Moon. His launching is from Florida. 3 astronauts who find the moon a dreary, inhospitable place and a splashdown in the Pacific where they are picked up by an American ship. It proves to be frighteningly accurate, except for the launching. Verne uses an atomic cannon, but the real source has been developed more than 600 years before. They are described in 1232 AD as arrows of flying fire, and the Chinese make them from the gunpowder they had invented. They are called rockets. In the 1600s, Johannes Kepler, a German scientist, develops laws of planetary motion. Sir Isaac Newton uses Kepler's work as a base for his laws of motion. Law 3 states, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. It is the precise principle of rocketry. It is not until the 1800s, however, that Sir William Congreve of England develops the rocket into a long-range military weapon. It weighs as much as 60 pounds and carries explosives. These are the rockets that burst above Fort McHenry in the War of 1812, and seen by Francis Scott Key, are described in his Star-Spangled Banner. It is now 1903, and the population of the United States is approximately 76 million people. It's the year of Chicago's centennial, the formation of the Ford Motor Company, and the first plane flight by the Wright brothers. It is also the year that a Russian named Tsiolkovsky publishes the first scientific paper on the use of rockets for space flight. Over the next 16 years, 2 men work independently to attack the technical problems of rocketry and high-altitude research. In 1919, Robert Goddard of the U.S. publishes a paper explaining how rockets could be used to explore the upper atmosphere and describes a way of firing a rocket to the moon. 4 years later, in Germany, Hermann Oberth of Germany publishes a book describing a spaceship for interplanetary travel. There is such interest that a German society for space travel is formed and leads eventually to the first successful guided missiles, the German V-2 rocket of World War II. After the war, Werner von Braun, a disciple of Oberth, comes to the U.S. to work. But post-war America is now a world power and too busy to worry about rocketry. There is some development. The WAC Corporal that can climb to a height of 30 miles but has no room for instruments, and then the Araby, which reaches 180 miles. The Navy develops the Viking, and Charles Yeager flies faster than sound in the rocket-powered plane, the X-1. But it is Russia that opens the space age in 1957 with Sputnik 1, shattering the U.S. timetable for space, and the Soviets do it with a payload 10 times heavier than we had planned. Americans are shocked, and there's a great hue and cry in Congress for an investigation of the situation, now called the Space Gap. Here's WBBM News Radio science editor, Dr. Leonard Reifel.
We knew how to build, because we were ahead of the Russians in nuclear technology, we knew how to build hydrogen bombs for a given amount of explosive force that didn't weigh very much. The Russians, as you probably recall, got the hydrogen bomb not too long after we did. But they did it in a much more clumsy way. The things weighed a great deal more. So that when they had to build ICBMs, they had to build big rockets to get those clumsy weapons across the ocean. We, on the other hand, had lightweight bombs, comparatively. We could build small rockets. Now, that was fine for ICBMs, at least in the first generation. But what it did was it moved the Russians ahead of us in the lifting of big payloads into orbit, and you know what that meant in the early days of manned spaceflight.
With the launching of the Russian Sputnik 1 and the resulting hubbub by Congress, the Eisenhower administration makes some decisions toward getting the U.S. into the ballgame. A special assistant for science and technology is created to advise Ike, and a civilian agency is given management of the space effort rather than the military. The Soviets have already run up an impressive number of probes, including the first space traveler, a dog named Laika. It is not until 1958 that the first American satellite is blasted into orbit. The Explorer is followed by the Vanguard and the Pioneer series. And then in December, Project SCORE becomes the first communication satellite to broadcast a voice message from space. That voice belongs to Dwight Eisenhower.
This is the President of the United States speaking. Through the marvels of scientific advance, my voice is coming to you from a satellite circling in outer space. Through this unique means, I convey to you and to all mankind America's wish for peace on earth and goodwill toward men everywhere.
1959 and 60 see more communication satellite launchings, and we send a rocket to orbit the sun, but U.S. space commitment is still limited. The Russians, however, have hit the moon with an unmanned space shot and photographed the dark side of the moon with another. And in 1961, Yuri Gagarin of the USSR becomes the first man to orbit the Earth. In the U.S., there are unemployment and desegregation problems. Relations with Castro's Cuba grow worse until 5 days after Gagarin's flight, the anti-Castro forces attempt an invasion of the Cuban Bay of Pigs. It's a miserable failure. John F. Kennedy is the new president, and Americans need something for their morale. It is May 5th, 1961.
3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff. Liftoff. And 34 minutes after the hour.
It's only a 15-minute suborbital flight, but Navy Commander Alan Shepard becomes the first American in space, 115 miles high and 302 miles downrange. We're in the manned space race, and it's something to cheer about.
Oxygen, go! All systems are go!
And now something to capture the imagination of the world. President Kennedy asks his advisors to find a space goal where the two nations, the U.S. and Russia, can start as equals and where American technology could likely win. 126 days after becoming president, JFK goes before Congress with a special request.
I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. We propose to accelerate the development of the appropriate lunar spacecraft. We propose to develop alternate liquid and solid fuel boosters, much larger than any now being developed, until certain which is superior. We propose additional funds for other engine development and for unmanned exploration, explorations which are particularly important for one purpose which this nation will never overlook: the survival of the man who first makes this daring flight. But in a very real sense, it will not be one man going to the moon. If we make this judgment affirmatively, it will be an entire nation, for all of us must work to put him there.
And Congress reacts enthusiastically. A moon landing becomes the national goal, setting into motion the greatest peacetime mobilization in U.S. history.
May the wee ones be with you, Thomas.
Good Lord, ride all the way.
Amen.
T-minus 10 seconds, counting. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
John Glenn becomes America's first man to orbit the Earth in February of '62, traveling at 17,500 miles per hour, crossing oceans and continents, going from daylight to darkness to daylight.
Fine. Capsule is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous.
The first phase of America's push to the moon, the Mercury series, ends in 1963 with Gordon Cooper making 22 revolutions of the Earth. Now it is time to learn something about man's ability in space. Can he endure, develop, and perfect the rendezvous techniques needed to make the moon trip work? That's the task of the Gemini series. 2-man flights, 10 of them in all, in a 4-ton spacecraft. Virgil Grissom becomes the first American to make 2 space trips, and in Gemini 4, Ed White takes the first U.S. walk in space, while his partner, Jim McDivitt, gossips from the inside of the space capsule.
Where are you working, Ed? I'm looking right now. Looks like we're coming up on the coast of California. I'm going at slow rotation to the right. No disorientation associated with it. One thing about it, when Ed gets out there and starts wiggling around, it sure makes the spacecraft tough to control. Take some pictures. Okay, I'm going to work on getting some pictures, Jim. Okay, get out front where I can see you again. Okay. Go slowly, I'll take your pictures.
Other Gemini flights see Borman and Lovell set a 14-day space endurance record. There's a space rendezvous and then the first space docking. Through the Gemini series, astronauts prove that manned capsules can hook up to an orbiting rocket stage, then use its own fuel to maneuver from one to the other. Gemini also pioneers the controlled gliding returns into the Earth's atmosphere, something Apollo pilots will have to rely on. It is 1967 now, and in the nearly 6 years of America's manned space flights, there have been no loss-of-life mishaps as a direct result of the program. There have been some close calls. During John Glenn's flight, for example, when voice contact was lost, and then again when the heat shield burned up during Glenn's re-entry. And the Gemini 8 shot in 1966 when Armstrong and Scott latched onto that Agena. 27 minutes after docking, a faulty thruster sent the entire assembly into whirling gyrations, but the astronauts coolly activated an emergency control and separated from the Agena. Now, as Apollo, the 3rd phase in America's manned space series, begins, the tragedy comes, not from space, but from the ground. It is February 21st, 1967.
Astronauts Virgil I. Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee were killed tonight in a flash fire during test of the Apollo Saturn 204 vehicle. The fire occurred while the astronauts were in the spacecraft during the countdown of a simulated flight test. The accident occurred at 6:31 Eastern Standard Time. Hatches on the spacecraft were closed. Emergency crews encountered dense smoke in removing the hatches. All data has been impounded pending investigation.
Investigating teams pin the probable cause on an electrical short circuit, but they also find repeated examples of sloppy workmanship and inferior materials. The investigation results in a complete rebuilding of the Apollo program. Now designs are reevaluated, new fireproof materials are developed, and after 19 months and nearly $500 million, Apollo continues. In 1968, Apollo 7 performs in orbit for 11 days and performs better than hoped for. Out of the turmoil and the tragedy has come perfection. And now, it is time for Apollo 8 and man's first close-up look at the moon.
10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. The engines are armed. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit. We have liftoff. This is 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders orbit the moon 10 times from a height of 69 miles above the lunar surface. And Americans listen to this description.
I know my own impression is that it's a vast, lonely, forbidding type existence or expanse of nothing. It looks rather like clouds and clouds of pumice stone. And it certainly would not appear to be a very inviting place to live or work.
But it is for these three men, these astronauts, these 3 men of science, to place man and time in proper perspective. Christmas Eve now, 1968. The voice from Apollo 8, in orbit, around the moon.
And the earth was without form, and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
In March of 1969, Apollo 9 astronauts James McDivitt, David Scott, and Russell Schweikert proved that the lunar lander indeed works. And in May, Stafford, Cernan, and Young rehearsed the lunar operations in orbit around the Earth during the 8-day Apollo 10 mission.
Well, the primary difference, of course, is the landing itself and the EVA. We've made an attempt to plan Apollo 10 and Apollo 11 so that everything is nearly the same as possible. For example, the activation and checkout procedures that will be used today for the lunar module. The attempt here is on Apollo 10 to very closely simulate 11. Of course, we can't simulate the powered descent and the EVA. However, let me point out that the total rendezvous is very much a simulation of the lunar type rendezvous that we'll do.
That's the voice of Mr. Clifford Charlesworth, NASA flight director of Apollo 11.
The spacecraft test conductor for the lunar module reported that Eagle was go. The swing arm now coming back to its fully retracted position as our countdown continues. T-minus 4 minutes, 50 seconds and counting.
The voice of Apollo 11. The place is Cape Kennedy, July the 16th, 1969. The hour is approaching 9:32 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The sun is bright, the sky a brilliant blue. For mankind, it is a countdown to history.
10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo
11. Astronauts Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin leave for the moon. Such a simple statement, such an acceptable statement now, and yet the realities are staggering. A 3-seat capsule shot into space by a rocket so big and so delicate it defies description. The trip, 8 days, more than 500,000 miles into space and back, traveling at speeds from 8,700 to more than 24,000 miles per hour. Most astounding of all is the fact that man is going to the moon. As he stands at the Cape watching the Apollo 11 launching, noted science fiction writer Arthur Clarke says, "It is the first time I've cried in 20 years and the first time I've prayed in 40.
8 miles downrange, 12 miles high.
In man's 1 million year history on Earth, his interest in the moon has ranged from mildly curious to an awesome compulsion to get there. The question is, why? We know that the lunar surface is silent and barren, made of rock and dust, mountains and craters. There is no food, no air, no water. Nights are bitterly cold, days unbearably hot. The moon has probably changed little in billions of years. The launching of Apollo 11 represents the culmination of an 8-year program of manned space flight. 300,000 Americans working for 20,000 corporations all over America at a cost of nearly $24 billion. Is it worth that kind of effort and expense? Here again is WBBM Radio Science Editor, Dr. Leonard Reifel.
I would say it is, and for that one deeply philosophical reason that I keep quoting. In fact, I thought about it for 5 years before I finally came to this one sentence. I say that the solution to the spaceflight problem reaches far beyond the problem, and it reaches out into social, scientific, economic, and all kinds of other spheres. And for the first time, you've got a second specimen of a planet to study. Up until now, you've got to realize it's been more or less for people interested in earth sciences and geology and where oil might occur and how mountains and earthquakes are created and all those kinds of things. They've had one specimen, the Earth.
When the Italian astronomer Galileo viewed the moon through the world's first telescope in 1609, he saw smooth, dark areas on the near side. He decided they were water, and he called them maria, the Latin word for seas. Since then, man has studied the moon by telescope for 3 centuries, and in the last few years photographed and probed the lunar surface by spacecraft. Man is now confident there is no water, but was there ever? And now, as Apollo 11 speeds toward the moon, will man find what science has led him to expect?
Yes and no. I think it will feel to walk around on it about like we feel it's going to feel, and that is walking around on crunchy snow. I think we may find some really tremendous scientific surprises. There are considerable amounts of evidence that something like rivers existed on the moon. For all we know, there are underground frozen areas that, who knows, they might have once upon a time, a few billion years ago, contained life forms that are still preserved there, much as in the glaciers or something here on Earth.
A tiny electronic heart pacer extends the life of a middle-aged man. A housewife has a specially coated frying pan to which foods will not stick. Your teenage daughter now has a transistorized radio that can be carried anywhere. It's smaller than ever and plays louder than ever. Spin-offs of the space age. And NASA says developments are coming so fast and thick that a special division has been created just to keep track of them. But what has been the effect on our society?
Well, I think there are multiple ones. I think in the early days it caused us to reassess our educational system. I think that the government involvement in educational improvement would not be as great as it is today were it not for Sputnik and the blow to national pride that involved. So space gets a little bit of credit there. I think that there are more people willing to look at the world as one world instead of a group of isolated nations because of the perspective that space gives. I think space became a very convenient rallying point for anti-government forces in the sense that they didn't like the policies for funding this instead of that and that kind of thing. It was a very vulnerable place for anybody who wanted more money for another worthy cause could say, what good is space? Because the payoff is much further down the road, the obvious payoff to the man in the street. And I don't know what that meant. I think in general I am impressed with the stability that this democratic process has shown.
When the Soviet Lunik fired a capsule from space and hit the moon 10 years ago, it raised the question, of course, of sovereignty. Although the Russians never pressed a claim of ownership, it underlined the need for some kind of pact or treaty. Such a treaty was proposed in 1966 by President Johnson, and Moscow was a prime mover in negotiating the pact. 89 nations have signed it under the title of Treaty of Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, the Moon, and Other Celestial Bodies. Here's Brigadier General Martin Mentor, Command Staff Judge Advocate of the U.S. Air Force Defense Command and Chairman of the American Bar Association's Committee on the Law of Outer Space.
One of the provisions expressly prohibits the installation of weapons of mass destruction on celestial bodies. Other prohibited actions on celestial bodies would be testing of any type of weapons, establishment of fortifications, and the conduct of military maneuvers. However, the treaty expressly recites that the use of military personnel for scientific research or for any other peaceful purpose shall not be prohibited. Now, this clearly permits our military astronauts to participate in NASA's current Apollo program.
And even as Apollo 11 nears the moon now, plans have been made for man's adventures beyond. Dr. Thomas Paine, director of America's space program, says the conquest of Earth's fellow planets will prove to be reasonably straightforward. As for the immediate future in space, this roundtable of comments now from Lieutenant General Samuel Phillips, director of the Apollo program, Joseph Loftus of NASA's Advanced Missions, and Dr. George Miller, NASA's director of manned space flight.
I'd say that the balance of effort so far has been reasonable. While we're making these early interplanetary steps with Apollo, we're also preparing in the manned flight area to use Apollo equipment and derivatives of Apollo equipment for more extensive operations in Earth orbit and some of the first steps that will lead to a space station. We're also preparing to use Apollo equipment over a period of 2 or 3 years for a series of landings on the moon, for exploring the moon, and if these exploration missions indicate that there's value in and reason for a lunar base, I think we're moving in that direction with these exploratory missions.
The agency has been exercising for the last several years and has formulated a plan for 10 lunar landings, which will fly some vehicles in the current Apollo configuration and modify some vehicles to have an expanded configuration capability. We will consider expansion to the propellant tanks of the lunar module in order to land a greater weight and to give us the increased delta V capability to land in types of terrain that are much rougher than those that we consider in the Apollo zone.
One of the things we've learned from the developments that have led to this capability for carrying out lunar exploration is some things about how to build better space vehicles. And in particular, one of the subjects that we're studying is the possibility of developing a space shuttle. Such a shuttle would provide a way to travel into space and back to Earth at a fraction of the cost of our present systems. And when we take advantage of that low-cost transportation, when you no longer are anywhere near as limited in the kinds of space activities that we can carry out in the future. In particular, with that kind of a transportation cost of a few dollars a pound compared to a few hundred or thousands of dollars a pound that we pay today, it's quite possible and in fact quite desirable to carry out a program of lunar exploration and Earth orbital exploitation simultaneously and cooperatively.
But man is really two animals. He's curious and he's prudent. One always seems at odds with the other. There have been times when the interests of both have coincided, and history has blessed those moments with special titles. The glory of Greece, the grandeur of Rome, the renaissance of Western civilization. And now man is poised for one of the greatest moments in time. After 102 hours in flight, the Apollo 11 is orbiting the moon, and the lunar landing module, called the Eagle, has left the mothership. Armstrong and Aldrin are in the Eagle now, and they must take control manually in order to find a reasonably smooth landing site. It is Sunday, July 20th, 3:17:42 p.m.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Mode control both autos. Eastern engine command override off. We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
And now it is 6.5 hours later, 9:56 p.m., and Neil Armstrong of the United States backs out of the 32-inch square front door of the Eagle, makes his way down the 9-rung ladder, and as the world listens and watches.
I'm at the foot of the ladder. The lamb footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. With that unpretentious, enormously understated sentence, the deed is done. Later, it is Richard Nixon who expresses the pride of a nation to the Moon men.
Go ahead, Mr. President. This is Houston out.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made from the White House. I just can't tell you how proud we all are of what you have done. For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives. And for people all over the world, I am sure that they too join with Americans in recognizing what an immense feat this is. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. And as you talk to us from the Sea of Tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to Earth. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one. One in their pride in what you have done, and one in our prayers that you will return safely to Earth.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's a great honor and privilege for us to be here representing not only the United States, but men of peace of all nations, and with interest and a curiosity and with a vision for the future. Honor for us to be able to participate here today.
And now Armstrong and Aldrin become professionals again, but American professionals. They collect the samples of moon rocks and dust and set up laser reflectors, but they also leap into the lunar space like kids, and they take pictures like tourists. The rest of the mission is as perfect as that already completed. The Eagle lifts off the moon's surface, rejoins the Columbia, and the return to Earth and the splashdown are routine. But 250,000 miles into space, the moon is not the same. There on the Sea of Tranquility is an American flag, a plaque that reads July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind. And all around are footprints. The footprints of man on the moon.